Hey, this is Rick Kaselj, injury specialist from exercisesforinjuries.com. Today's video is a special video for everyone over at Chalk and Steel. In this video, I want to go through the number one muscle you need to fix in order to improve your overhead squat. And what that muscle is the hip flexors. And let me explain why. There ends up being 3 reasons why that you need to work on improving the flexibility and mobility in your hip flexors in order to improve your overhead squat. Now the first one, I'll use this dowel to demonstrate things, is with tight hip flexors, it ends up affecting the pitch of the bar. So with tight hip flexors, if I bring the bar overhead, if I'm tight in the hip flexors, it ends up bringing the bar more forward, and that ends up putting a lot of stress on the shoulder, it puts a lot of stress on the knee, and ends up affecting how much weight that you can do when it comes to the overhead squat. So that ends up being the number one reason. The number 2 reason is when it comes to the hip flexors and the hip flexors being tight, they end up tilting your pelvis forward. So the tightness in the quads and deep in the hip, they'll end up tilting your pelvis forward. And when it comes to the squatting down, because that pelvis is tilted forward, you end up having less depth that you can go before you end up kind of jamming up or losing that, coming to the end of the range of motion in the hip flexors. So that ends up being the second reason. And then the third reason ends up being is the hip tightness of the hip flexors ends up affecting that depth because they end up being tight and they're preventing the hips from dropping down and getting further. So with the second one, you had the pelvis being tilted, but also those tight hip flexors end up having an effect on how far or how deep you can end up going. So there you go. If you end up having any issues when it comes to your overhead squat, take a look at your hip flexors and work on fixing them, specifically the flexibility and mobility. But remember, you can't just fix your hip flexors by grabbing a plate and sitting in a deep squat. There is more to it, and there's more than just that one exercise that you need to do in order to improve your hip flexor flexibility and mobility. I mean, if you want more details on a little 10 exercise routine that you can do in order to improve your hip flexor flexibility and mobility, just click the link above. You'll get more details on it. So this is Rick Kaselj from exercisesforinjuries.com, and a big thank you to everyone at Chalk and Steel.